Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Hyde. I'm an adult services librarian here at the Lake Oswego Library, and I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation on First Amendment freedom in Oregon libraries. Whether you're here with us in person or joining us via the live stream, we're glad you could join us today. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Friends of the Lake Oswego Public Library. The Friends are a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing enhanced support for library projects of community interest. We're pleased that you're participating in a library program. We'd love for you to know more about the Friends and the great programs they support, such as the Summer Library Challenge, music and author events, monthly trivia nights, and the fabulous Lake Oswego Reads program. Visit the Friends website to learn more about their work, including the boutique used bookstores and how you can join them in supporting the library. The library now has an assistive listening system that patrons can use to hear better during events that take place on the library's main floor. The system filters the sound to emphasize the speaker's voice and transmits it to a receiver the patron can wear around their neck. These devices are available for today's program, and they're located on that table in the back. We ask that patrons wearing the receivers sit near the front of the event space, as the receivers work best when they're within fairly close range of the AV system. If you're interested in leaving feedback about today's program, we do have brief surveys available in the back as well that you can fill out at the end. They're available on paper and in large print, and you can also access them on your mobile device via a QR code. And now back to today's event. This past year, there has been a staggering increase in instances of attempted book banning and censorship in Oregon libraries and in libraries across the country. In honor of Banned Books Week, which is being celebrated nationally October 1st through 7th this year, and in honor of Freedom to Read Month, which is being celebrated all month long here at the Lake Oswego Library, we have invited Emily O'Neill to speak with us about intellectual freedom and censorship in Oregon and around the country, and about what members of our community can do to combat censorship. Emily is the Technical Services Manager at the Deschutes Public Library in Bend. She's also the co-chair of the Oregon Intellectual Freedom Committee. Among her roles with the Oregon Intellectual Freedom Committee, Emily has been a champion supporter of intellectual freedom, supporting libraries against book challenges across the state, including drafting written statements, attending board meetings, and speaking out in support of intellectual freedom, as well as offering trainings to schools, library districts, and a variety of community organizations. We are so pleased and grateful to have her here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Emily O'Neill.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the warm welcome. This is my favorite topic to talk about. Intellectual freedom is so important, and I'm very, very passionate about it. So hopefully you get a lot of good information from this presentation and can see the passion as I go through these slides. So the first, I don't really need to add a whole lot to my introduction because I was included in my bio, but my name is Emily O'Neill, and I am the chair of the Oregon Intellectual Freedom Committee, which is a committee provided to you through the Oregon Library Association. I have been chairing that committee this is my third term. So right as the increase of challenges has begun to rage across our country, our state, our communities, is about the exact same time that I started chairing this committee. So I am pretty well versed as to what has been occurring and really why I'm here talking to you today. You can't really talk about intellectual freedom without talking about First Amendment rights, and you can't talk about First Amendment rights without talking about the law. And so when you talk about the law, you have to tell people whether or not you're a lawyer, and I am not a lawyer. So this is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, then I suggest contacting a practicing attorney in your area. So what is intellectual freedom? This is a definition provided to you from the American Library Association, and I'm not going to read the whole slide to you because it's a very lofty definition, and I think there's a better way to describe it, which is really just to reverse engineer the terms intellectual freedom and flip them around. So it is the freedom of your own intellect. It is the freedom to think. It is the freedom to deduce from one thing to another the information that you have taken into your mind and decide what that means to you. And so you get to be an independent thinker, and that is a right that is given to you at the time of birth in this country, and it is not something that can be taken away. So when you talk about intellectual freedom, people seem to think that that's a finite thing, and there is no such thing as a limit to your own thinking, your own intellect. And I think when you think about it in that way, it is really important to know that we would not argue with that. I don't know that anybody would argue that you can't be an independent thinker. And so as we go through challenges and have situations across our communities, one area that you can start to create a bridge on those gaps of knowledge on this is to start there. Do you believe in your ability to have independent thought? And maybe you can build a link there and start to have some bridges with some community members that really don't want independent thought and what you can do about that. So why does it matter? Well, it's unrestricted access to information and ideas. So you can't have independent thought and independent critical thinking without access to information. And so really your freedom of, your intellectual freedom is based on the information that you are allowed to absorb into your brain and then deduce from there what that means. So it's your freedom to decide what that information is going to be, and your freedom to absorb that information and learn from it, both good and bad, and decide what it is that you've learned. So all of the foundation of what it means to become really a critical thinking human being is based off of your intellectual freedom. And the most important part, well, maybe not the most important part, but a really important part for our community is that it's written into your First Amendment rights in this country. It is a legally given to you right that is protected by the United States Constitution. And so I want to talk about that foundation before we dive into anything else. So, the United States Constitution and libraries, a history. This is a little bit of a history lesson about the United States Constitution. So, back when the Constitution was ratified, there was originally not a Bill of Rights. That was not something that was originally included in the writing of the Constitution. But the colonies would not adopt the Constitution without the addendum, the addition of what is now known as the Bill of Rights. And the reason for that is the colonies realized there was a lack of awareness of what our civil liberties would be. And what that means is we need the government to recognize that we are human beings and that our humanness has rights, and that those have to be protected as we form this country. And that's the foundation of the Bill of Rights, is our civil liberties, what it means to be a human being in the United States. So when they drafted the Bill of Rights, everything in the United States Constitution at that time had meaning. So they purposely picked when a right was the first right versus the second right versus the third right. So under the Bill of Rights, the very first one, your First Amendment, has a lot of things in it. It has your freedom of speech, it has your freedom of press, it has your freedom to petition, and the reason all of those are lumped into that First Amendment is because they are equally important and they are all primary. They are number one importance to your humanness in this country. So under that First Amendment right is one called the freedom of speech. And the freedom of speech is the one that we're talking about today. And so a lot of people say, well, how does freedom of speech mean freedom of information, freedom to read? How is this even linked? Well, the way that our laws work is that as people challenge what a law means, it gets presented to a court of law. And through that court of law proceedings, they create what is called precedent. So it's when the judge makes a ruling and determines what that law means. And then that precedent is used for the next time that that law is challenged in court. And it helps create better foundation, more granulation of what a law means. So our Constitution has been around for hundreds of years. So there has been many, many, many court proceedings that have gone into what is freedom of speech. And through all of those years, courts have held that in order to have freedom of speech, you first have to have freedom of informed thought. So you have to be able to think. In order to speak, you need to be able to think. So then courts have further held that in order to think, you have to be able to have information. There isn't an ability to have a thought on something if you haven't been given the information on it first. Courts have then further held that where is information most often held? Well, in books. So now your freedom of speech is freedom of thought, freedom of information, freedom to read. And then finally, where are books held freely in our communities? Well, that's in libraries. And that is how libraries are immediately tied to your First Amendment rights of freedom of speech in this country. And it is a First Amendment protection that is very clearly documented across our court hearings for the last 250 years. And so people say, well, freedom of speech, that's awful big lift for a library. What does that mean? How could you, what support do we have for libraries? How does that exist on an organizational level? And so freedom of speech is applied, there are 3 different ways that is applied in our world and in our community in the United States. And that's through public forums. So there are 3 different types of public forums. The first one is called a traditional public forum, and that is what most people think of when they think of a public forum. They think of being able to petition in the park, or back when the Constitution was ratified and a politician was standing on some sort of stage in the middle of the town square. That's what's considered a traditional public forum, and that's why people can petition on sidewalks. It is an open space that doesn't belong to anybody, and it is an open forum where you can say pretty much anything that you want to say, also protected under that First Amendment right of freedom to petition. So that's a traditional public forum. Libraries fall under what is called a limited public forum. And that limited public forum says that you are responsible to uphold the First Amendment rights of the user to the highest level that you can. And we understand that in order to do that, there are things that have to occur. And so for you to be able to do those things, you can set what are called time, place, and manner restrictions on that space. And so, for example, a library can set a time restriction. They can say that our buildings are only open from this hour to this hour. We're not a 24-hour access building. You can't just be in here anytime that you want. And that's because the building has to be run by staff, and staff also have rights as employees and as members of our community, and they need to be able to go home. And so we can set time restrictions and your access to this space via time. You can set place restrictions. So, for example, the library here has areas that say it's staff only, and that's because the staff, in order to get all of these wonderful materials on their shelves, need to be able to process those books. They need to be able to catalog them, they need to be able to check them in and out, they need to be able to put them on carts and shelves, and in order to do that, they can't have customers going back in the area pulling things off the carts that they're trying to shelve. So you can say the members of the public are not allowed to be in staff spaces. That is a place restriction. And you can set manner restrictions. So manner restrictions are things along the lines of you cannot harass library staff. Library staff have a job to do that are, in order to uphold the intellectual freedom rights of everyone else around the community, they need to be able to do that job. And if you are harassing the staff, they are not able to follow through on their commitment to everyone else in this community. And so most libraries have something that's called a code of conduct, which really sets those manner restrictions that are really under the umbrella of, if you do this, you are infringing on the rights of everyone else in this space. Another good example would be a noise restriction. For example, you can't come in here with a boom box if everyone else is trying to research and read, things of that sort. But what you can't do are content restrictions. There is no amount of content restriction that is allowed as a traditional public forum. So What that means is you cannot say only certain genders are allowed in this space. You can't say only certain races are allowed in this space. Those would be content restrictions that are grossly illegal and are protected under a number of other rights on the United States Constitution. So really our containment of this space has to fall under one of those three things. And the last one, just because I said there were three and I want to commit to giving you full information, is a non-public forum. And a non-public forum is somewhere like the courthouse, where they still have a right, they have a responsibility to uphold your constitutional rights, absolutely. But you cannot just go into, say, a jail and go hang out with people in the back that are incarcerated. There are major restrictions, and they are not open spaces to the general public. So that's pretty lofty for librarians and libraries and districts to understand what are our time, place, and manner restrictions. How do we uphold these First Amendment rights of our communities? And so the American Library Association gives us some guiding documents that are really helpful to libraries as we work our way through what that means. So the first one is called the Library Bill of Rights. I didn't include the full thing here because I want to get through a number of slides today, and it just would have been a lot to cover the full extent of it. But within the Library Bill of Rights there are 10 total elements on it, and among them are listed here. So we provide materials for all. Materials represent all points of view. We challenge censorship. We are open to all. So again, information rights are not just the books that you read or the presentations that you come to, but it is everything that exists in this space. Access to this space is part of that First Amendment right. Meeting rooms, exhibit spaces are open to all equally. So as I just mentioned, information is absorbed in a wide variety of ways. Of course, we're talking about the books, but you are absorbing information right now, listening to me talk, and individuals have to have rights to be able to come to this conversation or any other conversation that is available to a library, especially as they have meeting rooms. And then, of course, privacy and confidentiality. So you have to be able to know that when you have an information need, no matter what that information need is, that you will not feel fearful that that information need is going to expose you in some way. So sometimes we're interested about learning about things that we don't want other people to know about. And you have, if your privacy was in question, you would choose to not learn that content, and therefore your information rights have been infringed upon. So privacy and confidentiality is just as important as, challenging censorship in any other way. ALA also provides some secondary documents that don't get quite as much attention, but are definitely worth a read. These are much longer, so I highly recommend going to ala.org to read them in full. But they're called the Freedom to Read and the Freedom to View statements. So the first one is specific to books, obviously, and the second one came out as we went to a more audiovisual world and really responds to access to visual materials similar to DVDs, for example, or movies. So like I said, I'm not going to go through every one of these elements, but these are really important ones that stand out to me every single time I read the Freedom to Read statement. So I'm going to go through each of these just for emphasis. So the first one in the Freedom to Read statement says that we trust Americans to make their choices, their own choices, on what they choose to read or watch. And that's really important, is that word choice. We believe that all of you, all individuals are allowed to choose what it is that they absorb. And that is not something that we will infringe upon. That is an individual choice, and we believe that people will make it individually for themselves. We trust Americans to recognize propaganda and misinformation, which is really an important statement and a pretty loud one if you think about what has occurred over the last 3 years, over the COVID pandemic, over, hashtag fake news. it is something that librarians, we are here to help guide you in your information needs, but we are not here to tell you that your information need is correct or incorrect. So this came up quite a bit again during COVID, when libraries would have materials that would be both pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine. We have a right to, a responsibility to provide for every information need and to allow individuals to absorb that information and to make their own choices on that. And that one can be difficult because another thing to keep in mind is we don't know why people choose to read what they read. They may be choosing to read something you don't personally agree with because they also don't agree with it, and they want to learn more about what a counter viewpoint might be saying on the topic, and it's not our responsibility to restrict that access. We do not believe that Americans would sacrifice their right to press or information in exchange of a protected worldview. So this is a really big one of what has been happening right now in our communities, is this idea that we need to protect our communities from certain types of information. And there isn't any documented proof that this information is hurtful in any way, shape, or form. But beyond that, it isn't our responsibility to create a perfect bubble of information that somebody would live in. We believe that you would make that choice for yourself and would not sacrifice your First Amendment rights in an exchangement of that protected worldview. We believe Americans favor free enterprise of ideas and expressions. So back to what I said originally, intellectual freedom is freedom of your own intellect, and we are a very opinionated society. And you are allowed to have that opinion, and we are not here to tell you that your expression of that, your absorption of that is wrong in any way. And the last one is we defend the constitutional rights of all individuals, including children and teens, to use library resources. And this one is the crux, really, of what has been occurring over our communities over the last several years. And before I move on to the next slide, which will talk about this in fuller detail, what is a misunderstood element is that our First Amendment rights are given to us at birth. So rewind 10 minutes ago when I was talking about the foundation of our United States Constitution. These are our civil liberties. These are our liberties that are given to us at birth in this country. This is what it means to be human in the United States. It is not something that you age into. You don't get your civil liberties when you turn 18 and get a driver's license. They are given to you at birth, and they're not something that we as a library will ever infringe upon, regardless of the age of the individual that has the information need. And so people say, well, what about the kids, right? Because there is a concern in our communities, in our world, of what is appropriate for children to read, what is appropriate for one individual family to absorb. And again, courts have held repeatedly that we, as a public library, do not serve in loco parentis, which means in replacement of the parent. So we are not here to guide the reading or viewing habits of any one child. The only individual that can legally do that is that child's legal guardian. So if a parent or legal guardian is upset about the content that their child has absorbed, that is entirely on that parent to guide the reading and viewing habits of their own individual children. It is not something that the library can legally do. It is also not something that any other parent can legally do on a family that is not their own. So among the concerns is, well, I didn't want my child to read that, so nobody should. And that ultimately is the issue, is that not only will I not tell you what your child can read or not read, but you can't tell anybody else that either. That is a family unit decision that is guided very clearly by the courts as a very individual decision to each individual household. And so this is a lot of work for libraries, a very heavy lift that our communities are often unaware of. There's a lot that goes into all of this and a number of scenarios that we're not going to get to today. But if there are any things that you are wondering, well, what about bulletin boards, or what about internet filtering, or what about labeling systems or ranking systems? ALA offers us a website called the Interpretations of the Bill of Rights, and there's about 30 some odd scenarios on there that you can go to that kind of help guide more of those sticky situations. And so what we're talking about today is censorship. And I want to take a minute to define what censorship is, because one argument that I've been hearing more often lately is, well, we're not talking about banning books. You know, a child, a parent, a family, an individual can go on Amazon and buy that book. So if it's still in production, it's not banned. And then therefore, what's the big deal? You still have access to that information. And that's a very slippery slope argument that actually doesn't have a lot of foundation, because again, rewind, 10, 15 minutes ago, libraries are the place where our communities get free information. We require to uphold the information rights of everyone in our community, regardless of their economic status, for example. And if somebody doesn't have the commerce to buy that content, if they were only able to access it from a library, their information rights have also been infringed upon. So yes, you may be able to buy these titles through commerce, but that requirement of having economic ability in order to have access to that information does create censorship for the individual that can't afford that. So what is censorship? Censorship is the idea that you want to suppress ideas or information for everyone. So, another argument that is often made is that, well, I don't want my family to read that. And that's absolutely fine. Actually, at no point am I going to require anybody to read anything, because that would in some ways be just as bad. We are not requiring any one individual to read any one title, but it is an individual choice, and it's the expansion to everyone that is the concern. It is that no one else has a chance to read or view this materials because I disagree with it, and taking it out of the individual onto the community, onto an impact to those around you, onto the First Amendment rights of everyone else, that it becomes a censorship concern. And so there's a lot of different ways to restrict access to materials. I've touched on a few as we've gotten up to this slide, but among other arguments that are made is that it's not censorship because blank, 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 blank. And so I want to take you through about 5 different ways that material access is restricted or lost that are all considered censorship, and only one of them, as you see, is removal. So the first one is redaction or restriction. And so if you were to make a policy that said, well, you can keep the book, but I only want it restricted to, say, a certain age group, or you can keep the material, but it is we have to have a parent approval slip before you can get access. What that means is that access to that material has been lost universally. So if you are restricting it to a certain age group, again, everyone in that age group has now lost access. And we have created a law, a rule, that says that we are now acting in parental locus. We are in loco parentis, which we, again, don't do. We are not allowed to say that a 17-year-old can or cannot check out a book. Only that individual parent can do that. So to create a restriction, say, based off of age, would be censorship and a restriction on that individual's First Amendment rights for everybody under the age of 17, that perhaps their family unit would want their child to read that individual material. The next is redaction. So you can say, well, we're, again, not removing the title, but let's just black out part of it. Let's just say, this one particular sentence, or this one slide in a graphic novel, or this one area of, this video, let's just cut that. And again, if that information existed prior to that redaction, you are now taking away information that used to exist in this world and used to be available to the entire community, and are now saying it's not available to anyone and is a restriction on their access to that material in full. The next is relocation. So saying, well, again, I'm not telling you to get rid of the material, but maybe if you just move this, from the kids section to the adult section, then kids won't have as much access to it, or they won't see it as readily, but the library still has it. Well, again, if the kid if that child did have access to it previously, and it has been moved to a spot where they are not likely to discover it, that means that their access to that information has been restricted in a way that infringes on their right. The other part of that is that when an author creates a book, they create it with an intended audience in mind. And as that author goes to publication, they share with their publisher what the intended audience is of that material. And that intended audience is relayed to libraries as we catalog our materials and is honored. It is an objective process that we follow in full. It is not subjective as to why we would put something in one age group or another. We are honoring the intention of that author, the intention of that publisher to reach the intended audience. And if we move it to a different audience, the access to that audience has been lost. It is no longer being marketed to the individuals that the book was written for and that information was intended to share with. The next is a relabeling. So this one is the idea of putting warning labels on books. And so individuals will say, well, if we could at least tell parents or guardians that, that this might have explicit content in it, then they could make that choice easier for their community. But again, if you were to put a warning label on a book and say that child or teen was needing that information and really was curious and needed to, understand their world in a way that maybe not everyone was in agreement with, if that book has a warning label on it, and let's say their household is not safe for them, they're probably not going to check that book out. So being more clearly stated, let's say it's a 16-year-old that is unsure about their gender identity, and they want to check out a nonfiction book that helps them understand what it is that they're feeling, and that says explicit content on the side, and they go home and they're in an abusive household, that is not a safe thing for them to take home. That is not something that they will choose to do, and their information rights have been restricted because of that label on that book. And then the last, again, is removal. So removing the material entirely. And so, again, a lot of the arguments are, well, it wasn't banned because it's one of these other things. And there's a lot of different ways to, restrict the access to information that isn't just full removal from a library system. And so then this is one of the more uncomfortable slides, so I want to give credence to that. But we have to talk about what are the restrictions to freedom of speech, because there are some, and people will say, what are those restrictions? So there are some that have been governed to us by law based off of First Amendment court rulings. And the first one is obscenity as defined by the law through the Miller test. So obscenity is a term that is thrown around quite a bit in our communities as they are working their way through what is in library materials, what is access to this information. And obscenity is a legally defined term, and it is one that there is no vagueness of what obscene is, and unless you use it under the legal definition, it's not true. It's used subjectively. And so the legal definition of obscenity is provided to us through what is called the Miller test. And the Miller test says that all three of these individual statements must be true in order for something to be obscene. So it is all three of these together rather than separately for something to reach this definition of obscenity. So the first one is whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find the work taken as a whole appeals to indecent interests. So what that says is that every single member of this community, if they were to access that title, that material, every one of them would find that the material in its entirety is indecent. So the entire book would be indecent, and every single person in this room would agree. The second, because again, there are 3 elements to the Miller test, so that one in and of itself is very challenging. The second is that whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. So it has to be about sex. So if the concern is that it's obscene because it has, for example, people of color or written by people of color, it's not obscene. If it's too violent, it's not obscene. If it has vulgar language, still not obscene. The Miller test says it is only obscene if it's about sex or has sexual content. The third is one where we get stuck quite a bit in book challenges, is that whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So essentially saying that this book, this work, this piece of information has 0 scientific value, 0 artistic value, 0 literary value. That the only purpose for this content is to be indecent and sexual in nature. The only title that I've ever been aware of that has met the obscenity law is Penthouse and Playboy back in the early 90s. And actually Playboy challenged that because they have articles that are actually pretty well written and researched, and they showed actually scientific and political value. And so they won that, and even Playboy is no longer considered obscene under the court of law. The second is child pornography. So people will say, well, this work is pornographic. And porn, adult porn, for adult mature audiences is not illegal. Child pornography is deeply illegal. And there is nothing in this library that is child pornography. That would be offensively illegal, and we would be in a significant amount of issue and trouble for that. So again, the only part that becomes illegal is when pornography becomes child pornography. And again, child pornography does have a legal definition. That legal definition is that it is an actual child that is under the age of 18. So it is not illustrations, it's not words written in books. It has to be a visual depiction of an actual child for it to be illegal. And of course, not sexual in nature. So moving beyond the 2 very scary, very concerning areas where libraries are getting accused of obscenity and pornography, there are still some additional things that are illegal under freedom of speech that are worth mentioning. The next is defamation and slander. So you cannot, tell lies, knowingly tell lies that would hurt somebody's character on a public forum. Which is interesting because some of these counter challenges are actually defaming and slandering libraries and library staff in their accusations by saying that they're groomers and child pornographers. So it is a bit of a twist on words to say that you're, breaking First Amendment rights when actually the counter argument is doing just that. The next is fighting words. And this one is a bit of a challenge because on the counter side of book challenges is the idea that our materials carry hate speech, or that maybe that group using the meeting room is from a hate group. And it is unfortunate, but hate speech is not yet defined by a court of law. So what that means is that hate speech is not an objective term and it is not something that is legally unprotected under the First Amendment rights. In short, hate speech is still protected speech under the First Amendment rights in this country. Until it goes into a court, hate speech is still something that is allowed in this world. What is not allowed are what are called fighting words. So fighting words have to be imminent physical harm. So this is the one that individuals always say, well, you can't yell, fire in a crowded movie theater. And the reason for that is that if it is a crowded movie theater and hundreds of people are trying to run out in a dark space downstairs, there is a high likelihood that somebody will get trampled and will get, either seriously injured or killed. And so if the incitement of those words will cause immediate physical harm, that is not protected by the First Amendment. And then the last one is national security via the Patriot Act. The United States government can censor anything they want at any given time if they say it's under national security. Okay, so what is this to the impact the community? So individuals will say, well, but libraries do get rid of these materials, these attacks on information and the wave of book challenges. Some libraries are getting rid of materials, and what does that mean? And the reality is that they are getting sued. So again, this is a legal conversation, and people want to say that they're getting away with it, and the law takes a long time. It takes process to understand the facts of the case, to really get the Freedom of Information Act reports back. But when materials are coming back that are showing infringement on First Amendment rights, these library systems are not getting away with it. And so they are getting sued, they are getting lawsuits, and it gets very expensive for the libraries, for the library communities. So essentially, if you want to avoid lawsuits, then you need to avoid censorship. And it's really important for libraries to be aware of the financial impact of choosing to remove that access. And then the other part of this is what is getting challenged. So every year, the American Library Association puts out the top 10 most challenged books. And this year, they put out actually the top 13 because there were a number of ties on that top 10 list. But the commonality across these titles is that they are almost all materials that are character-driven by or written by LGBTQ members of our community or the people of color member of our community, which tells us a lot. It tells us, A, that materials are not getting challenged equally, that it isn't a concern over sex, it isn't a concern over violence, it isn't a concern over vulgar language. It is concern over members of our community that are not getting represented equally, and people are wishing to keep that way. They're saying that these members of our community don't belong here, that their stories don't belong here, that I don't want to hear about a way of life that is different than my own. And it is specifically two members of our community that are getting targeted. It is not universal. We're not saying, it's not religion-based. It's not, saying, I don't like violence in my books. We're saying there are people in our community that shouldn't exist. And it's based on fear and power. And it's unfortunate that their stories are the ones that are being told don't get to have a place on our shelves. So I've mentioned a few times that there's this rage, right? This wave of censorship that has been happening across our country. And but I haven't really shared the statistics of what that is. So again, ALA provides resources and statistics on the number of censored and banned materials that have occurred over year by year. And as you can see, it's grown astronomically since 2020. And actually, we already know that this time last year, we have already surpassed the number of materials that were had been challenged this time last year. previously. So October 2023 has already had more challenges this year than October 2022 did. So we are not at the top of this spike in any way. A lot of people say, well, why? What happened in 2020? Why are materials all of a sudden becoming a focus? And a lot of people will say it's because of the COVID pandemic, and that parents were more aware of the materials their children were reading in school and the materials that they had access to. They're just at home watching the screens, being more present. And though I do think that may have an element to it, I don't know that that is the full story. I also think we had a lot that happened in 2020. We saw more individuals sharing their gender identity more openly in our world, and just being more aware of differences in our communities. We saw a huge increase of violence against members of our people of color community through our police, and we're strongly exposed to continued racism in our country. And I think that we were also very scared from the pandemic. It created a huge divide in what any one family or individual was comfortable with as we were working our way through a very scary moment. And I think we as a society divided. And when you divide, that's when materials become scary. Because how does somebody learn about an opinion different than your own? Well, they read about it. And so if you don't want the other side to feel the way that you feel, well, if we get rid of their information, maybe they can't learn that difference of opinion. Maybe they have to learn my way. And I think it has to do more with a divided society than it has to do with our kids being at home reading school books. So in Oregon, we are not immune at all. I think a lot of things people are unaware of is, it feels like on a national level, and it's definitely not at just a national level. So last year, so July 1, 2022 to June 30, 2023, Oregon had 46 individual challenge instances, and those 46 resulted in 93 individual titles. So what that means is all 46 of those could have had the same title. Let's say it was gender queer, and that would account for one of those 93 titles. And so we are knowing that in there being 46 challenges and 93 titles, oftentimes things are getting challenged in bulk. So lists and lists of books are getting presented as a concern as opposed to one individual title. We also know that a lot of, this is somewhat different than the national statistic. So a number of the challenges do happen in schools, but a wide majority of them have occurred in public libraries. And actually, the American Library Association is reporting an increase of challenges at public libraries this year, 2023, in their reporting. And again, if you think about the process of really this being a restriction on how people think, they'll start with schools and say, well, let's stop the kids from learning this way of life. Let's, cease access to this information. And when they succeed, then they'll say, oh, well, they still have access to it at the public library. And so then they move on to the next bigger institution. And then they'll say, well, we got rid of it at the public library, but you can't read about it academically. So then they'll go for the academics. Well, but they could still buy it on Amazon. So then they go for the publishers. This is a very clear tactic, and it's taken one step at a time, and they are graduating from schools to public libraries, and we are seeing that statistically. And it's not just members of our community. So we are hearing that, of course, parents are aware of the materials that their children are reading and will put forth challenge reports. But we also know that there are organized groups that are putting forward challenges. So there was a very famous Washington Post article that came out earlier this spring that said 60% of the challenges that have raged this country came from 11 individuals last year. So they're an organized group that are putting forward challenges, and they're not even necessarily in the community. They're just wanting to control the information narrative across our country. So if you want to know about all of the challenges that are happening across our country and stay current, the American Library Association, the Office of Intellectual Freedom, puts out a weekly blog of all of the instances they're able to find. This is, you can't read it, and because the text is so small, and that's because that was 1 week's worth of links to challenges that have happened, and every single week there are new articles, new instances, and I know of quite a few that never even made it onto this list from Oregon, so it's not even complete. So I'm going over on time, and I hope that that's okay. I'm going to really quickly go through some instances that have happened across Oregon, just so you can understand really what our local communities are dealing with. So the first is, I mentioned that intellectual freedom isn't just the books, it's all of the ways that you absorb information, and that includes access to presentations and programs. So Klamath County Public Library, this is also still ongoing. So this is a current event that is happening in Klamath right now. Their county commissioners told, there was a book club that had been existing for several months called the Social Justice Book Club. And it had no concern by anyone, including the county commissioners, who are the executive body of that county library system, until they chose a book called No More Police. And one of their county commissioners is the former chief of police. And so he called the library and basically said, shut it down, and stopped the book club and actually moved forward to say, I don't want there to be any political programming in the library at all. And of course, that is a content-based restriction that is not allowed in libraries based off of the First Amendment right. And so his argument has been that library employees are tax-paid employees based off of tax dollars, and therefore, if they were to provide political programming, they would be endorsing politics, and therefore, and that's illegal. So it would be considered political endorsement, and library employees cannot do political programming. No, none of that is true. Political endorsement is actually saying vote for this person or that person. It's not talking about politics. Those are two very different definitions and statements. And that actually libraries are a place where you're supposed to have political discourse and conversation. Where they're at right now is that the library is allowed to move forward with political programs, but that it has to be run by volunteers. And though we don't love that solution, access to the information has been restored because they're still doing politics in libraries. It is allowed to be run by volunteers, even though the facilitation of that could be challenging. This one happened in Crook County last year. This is an ongoing situation in Crook. So the school district in the Crook County does not have a library in their elementary school. And so they had an agreement with the public library that they would visit the public library in lieu of them having a media center at their own school. A parent was concerned about materials that was found at the Crook County Library, and the agreement for those students to access the public library was ceased. So children in Crook County have zero access to library services as of right now. That parent continued forward and did ask for the removal of all LGBTQ materials from the entire Crook County library system. She later recanted and did ask to have all of those materials labeled with a warning label. That vote went in front of the Crook County Library Board in December of 2022, and at the time they decided not to relabel or restrict those materials. That board makeup has changed dramatically in the last 9 months, and so we will be interested to see if that decision stands. This is ongoing. I'm not going to Well, I will quickly talk about 2 actual removals of materials that have happened. So again, the worst case scenario is removal of materials. So the first is the graphic novel version of The Handmaid's Tale was removed from the Medford High School 18 months ago. And through a number of efforts with the Intellectual Freedom Committee, we have continued to try and advocate for the return of that title to that high school and to those communities. And as of right now, that material is still being censored from library access and has not been returned to the shelves. The next one is probably more timely and something definitely to be aware of because it has been ongoing even just this last week, Banned Books Week. Canby School District had a list of 36 titles that were under review this summer. They had already infringed on the rights of students because they removed those titles during the review process. So again, access to that information was removed during that process. Supposedly, the process occurred over the summer. What should have happened is that the community would have been notified of the decision of those reconsideration process and given the opportunity to appeal. We're not sure if the community was ever aware that the decision had been made, but at some point this summer, the decision was made to remove the classic novel Lolita with restriction and relabeling of some additional titles. We don't know what those additional titles are. Because it has been so unclear, the ACLU of Oregon, and in combination with a new nonprofit organization, Parents Defending Schools and Libraries, just delivered what's called a FOIA request or a public records request to the Canby School District just 2 days ago on Thursday to get better access of what happened in Canby. So I'm going to move through those last slides. I want to talk lastly of what you can do. And so one thing is exactly what you're doing today. So being informed members of your community, being aware that this is happening and standing up, having conversations with your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues about the importance of intellectual freedom. Don't be quiet about it. Make sure that people are aware that this is occurring in our communities. The Intellectual Freedom Committee has a toolkit that is available to anyone. It's a LibGuide, and it offers a lot of resources to libraries on how to prepare and respond for challenges, but also members for the community on how to learn more about what's been going on. And then you can get involved. So there are 2 main organizations that I would love to point you to. The first is, again, back to the situation of what has occurred in Canby. There's a petition through the fightforthefirst.org that's really defending the rights of those students and asking for return of the materials to their original state on the shelves. So removing the restriction, the relabeling, and returning Lolita to the shelf. I mentioned a little bit just a moment ago, we have a new nonprofit here in Oregon called Parents Defending Schools and Libraries. This is an awesome new organization. The founder is an ex officio member of our committee, and the intention is to sign up for a newsletter so you can be alerted of challenges as they happen in your individual communities. When that challenge occurs, the very best things you can do is fight back. So go to the board meetings, share that you don't stand for censorship, do letters to the editor, talk to the administrators, talk to the people of power in your community, because what will happen is, what has happened is they'll hear a really loud voice from 2 members of the community asking for removal. And if you get 200 people asking for, keeping access, that you could sway that decision from those power makers. And then really big, which is a huge ask, but should it come down to needing to move forward legally, really going down the road of, next steps, legal review of information rights. If it has happened to you, you have rights. So if you are in this community and a material has been removed, you are able to contact members of the ACLU, the National Coalition of Against Censorship, the Fight for the First, and ask for next steps within the legal realm. And that really is the best way to make sure that we don't stand for this as community members. And I am over on time, but I would love to see if there are any questions you all have. Yeah. I'm going to let Heather answer questions specifically for, do you know what your reconsideration process is here for Lake Oswego?
We do have a reconsideration process. That policy is on our website, and I can show that to you. But we do have a process that folks can go through to challenge materials. And it's, I think, been approved by our board. So we do have steps in place, and I think that while materials are being considered, I think our policy is to keep them on the shelf in the meantime.
Mm-hmm.
Publicly releasing an individual's name on the challenge form, is that something the library does? Gives that up for public records? It becomes public record, does it not?
That's a difficult one. So the question, you had the mic, but the question was, when you fill out a request for reconsideration form, does your patron information get disclosed if somebody were to put forward a public records request? So that has not been litigated in Oregon yet. It is something that was recently litigated in Colorado. There was a situation in Colorado where somebody had put forward a form and a FOIA request had gone through and the library had released it in full. It was challenged. I believe that the library won that case, that it was part of public record to release the content in full. That said, every library in Oregon might be a little different. So my particular organization, we do not release the public, the individual's name or identity when we report to the state, because we do report all of our challenges to the state. The State Library of Oregon compiles that, and then that material gets sent to ALA for those top 10 most banned books. So to understand instances and titles, it is not necessary for us to infringe on the privacy rights of our individuals. So when we report to the state, we do not include it. We do keep a form in full if we were to get a FOIA request, and we would release it in full because it would be considered censorship and redaction on our part if we were to restrict that. I believe we would also say, we expect you to uphold the privacy rights of this user. So there are ways that you can negotiate FOIA requests with the asker to say, we will release this, but you also have expectations with that individual's privacy rights, which is why it got so complicated in Oregon or in Colorado. But again, it has not been litigated here in Oregon yet, so we will see what the final outcome is if it ever moves forward. The question was, do we take anonymous requests for reconsideration forms? Every library has slightly different forms. Our library does not. And the reason for that is traditionally the way that a request for reconsideration would go is that it is an individual that is upset about content, and that we as a library have a responsibility to research that content and make sure it still fits our collection development policy, and then follow up with that customer to say, we reviewed your concern and here is the outcome. We can't follow up with that customer without knowing who it was. And so it really kind of stops the process from a review, because if you don't have somebody to follow up with, then there isn't really a reason to review the material. Yeah. Yeah, the question was, can we talk about self-censorship? So self-censorship does happen. It's happening more and more because many of the tactics that are being taken at libraries are very uncomfortable. So members are going to, people are going to their board meeting and using what can best be described as aggression tactics, really bullying essentially to try and get their point made and have the materials removed on the spot. And so, again, I mentioned librarians are getting attacked. They're being called names. They are getting slandered. They are getting threats, both in person and on social media. And so it's really easy to say, I don't want that attention on me. I don't want to have to experience that publicly on a public forum with, boards or, myself personally. And so one of the easy ways to say, well, I'm not going to expose myself to that is to just choose not to have the material to begin with. But the reality is that we as librarians have what are called collection development policies that help guide what should be in our libraries, and we should be following that objectively with every title. And so if a title fits your collection development policy and the only reason why you're choosing not to buy it is for fear of controversy, that is still censorship. That is a content-based restriction and decision that you're making, and you're not offering access to that information even though you're scared of that controversy. And it happens, I said at the collection development level, but it can also happen with weeding. So you can say, oh, I bought it originally, but somebody might find it, so I'll just get rid of it and say that it didn't circulate. But again, if you wouldn't have weeded it with your other objective weeding criteria, then it is still a content-based restriction. Some people will just say it went missing, so lost, and remove it that way. Members of the community can do it with what shadow banning is, so throwing things away or hiding them in the stacks, or checking them out without checking them out. There are a lot of ways that individuals try and force the collection that isn't just going through the reconsideration form. Luckily, oftentimes those individuals don't realize that libraries have ways of tracking those missing and lost materials. They show up on, review lists, and we will just rebuy them. So though we get the tactic, it isn't a successful one.
I have a question. I don't understand self-censorship. What's your definition? Because are you talking in terms of the library doing self-censorship? Or you personally?
I was talking about both. So another way you can self-censor is if you find a... Sorry, I've never used the microphone before. This is the first day for everything. So I was speaking about both. So one of the ways you can self-censor too is if you come across a title that people have a problem with, you can say to yourself, well, I really want to read this book, but I'm not going to check it out because I don't want somebody to see me in public with it and have to answer questions about it. So that's a form of self-censorship also. So
Yeah, and it's a good point because I mentioned you don't always know why somebody will check something out. So I think there's this paradigm where we believe if somebody checks something out, it's because they agree with it, and that's not always the case. Like for me personally, my absolute favorite things to read are all of the banned books. I want to know why they're getting banned. I want to know what's in them. So it doesn't have to do with me agreeing or not agreeing in any way, shape, or form. It has to do with sheer curiosity. And that curiosity leads me through my nonfiction selections, where I will often pick out books that I just don't agree with, but I'm so curious why somebody else would. And so they, kind of back to the COVID example, like you have no idea why somebody would want to read pro this politician or anti this politician book. They might not politically align with that in any way, shape, or form. They're just very curious, and they are allowed to have that information fulfilled.
I personally have checked out these books that have been banned. I'm like you. This is not comfortable with this mic. I'll yell. No, because I want to know. I'm very concerned about what's happening to our kids, and in terms of our education, what are we teaching? So I'm very concerned about that. So when I read and hear about these books getting banned, I'm thinking, in a library? I mean, this doesn't make sense to me. So I'm missing the big picture. So when your question was about, is the information, is it, going to be given to someone? I think it can be misconstrued. People are going to think I am so racist, anti-gays, you name it. Look at her library card, So it is a concern of mine, and everything out there, I keep hearing that people say, oh, yeah, they were picked up because of, I don't know, some information. Is like, how did they get that information? So I'm going off script on this. So to your point, and my point is, yeah, I'm checking them out because I want to know, and I do have concerns. So that's where really my question to you is, and you just mentioned it, you do have guidelines.
We do.
You have a collection development
Policy.
because obviously you don't have all the money in the world.
No.
And so where would I find that? Is that at the AOL or?
Yeah, great question. So just like most libraries have a process in place to review book challenges, most, if not all, libraries have their own individual collection development policy. So here at Lake Oswego, they would have a collection development policy available on their Lake Oswego website. At my institution, we have one that's probably pretty similar. They often have very similar elements, but they might differ a little bit. So, for example, my library is considered a popular lending library, and so what that means for us is that we won't necessarily have the full breadth of an entire author's works. So we might not have, Stephen King's novels from the 1980s, not because they're not valuable, but because our buildings are only so big. And so we choose his most current novels as opposed to his older novels. And so we infill that information need, like if you wanted to read those books from the 80s, through our interlibrary loan services. So you would still have full access to that material. We would just borrow it from another library. But yes, you're right. Our buildings are only so big, and so we have to have ways of objectively choosing what it is that we buy or don't buy. Now, I wanted to circle back to the question you had, too, about your lending history and saying, oh, somebody could judge me off of the materials I've checked out. So one big misconception is libraries don't keep your lending history. That is not something that our systems can keep. We specifically don't have that built into the software in our systems, and that's because we want to protect your privacy, and largely comes back from the Patriot Act back in the 2000s, is that the federal government would try and come to libraries and ask for lending history, and if we have a software that doesn't keep it, then we can't provide that. Now, some online catalogs at the user level, so at your own individual login, will let you opt into your own reading history. And so if you turn that on, you get access to your reading history, and that's for yourself, but the library cannot access that account. So nobody will see what you're reading except for you.
Oh, that's interesting because I have my history, and I'm thinking,
Yeah, that's
out there.
yours.
But then it leads to the next question. It's stored somewhere, and if the government wanted access to it, I don't know. It just leads to another question about it. If it's there,
It would probably be through the software company, so not through the library itself. But often we don't partner with software companies that don't uphold our privacy and confidentiality contracts. So even though we contract with them, they would not be able to break our contract to offer that information if the federal government went to that software company as opposed to the library itself.
And just to clarify, we do have that set up at this library. So we don't track what you check out, but you do have the option to opt in to save your own reading history on your account. And when you do that, I think there's a little bubble that pops up that talks about what that means. So if there is some kind of, I don't know, records request, it'll kind of outline what that will look like. But we do have that for anyone who is curious, and we don't access that ourselves. Yeah, we don't have that capability. Yeah. And I also do, my colleague very thoughtfully printed out a copy of our materials collection policy here, which includes our policy for citizen requests and challenges. So if anyone is interested in this, feel free. I'll have it at that table, and I'm happy to make copies. It's available on our website, but it goes over just the general philosophy that we take about collection development here at Lake Oswego. It talks about access to the collection, the scope of the collection, and the different criteria that our librarians take into consideration when making purchase decisions, and decisions about when to remove materials from the collection. And usually that just comes down to like lack of use, wear and tear, damage, newer additions. So all of that's covered here, and we're always happy to answer any questions. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I hope you found this useful, informative. I do want to say I am always open to having any additional conversations. I didn't put my contact on here, but again, I am the chair of the Intellectual Freedom Committee through the Oregon Library Association. So the contact information is on the toolkit that I shared on one of our slides. And so if you ever need to contact the IFC or the chair directly, all of that's available through this toolkit. Yes, in some ways. So every state has their own library association, and if they partner with the American Library Association, which nearly all states do, we get certain federal funding from the museum IMLS grant. So the Institution of Museums and Libraries, I want to say. Something like that. So we get IMLS grants, and those monies get distributed to libraries through their state association. And those go towards things like summer reading programs. Oregon Band, our Battle of the Books is part of that program. Sometimes we get money for, book mobiles. So having that link to our federal ALA helps with funding with our library. So most state organizations do link. Oregon does. There has been some controversy lately that state organizations are trying to move away from their association with ALA. This is often in more politically conservative communities because of feelings that ALA is not supporting their conservative points of view. So some of that includes everything that we just talked about is really not wanting the guidance from ALA through the Bill of Rights, not wanting the guidance from ALA on the freedom to view and freedom to read statements. And so breaking that link makes them feel like they might have more availability to restrict access and content, not knowing that it really doesn't have anything to do with ALA, but has more to do with First Amendment rights in the United States Constitution. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Yeah. One last question. Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah. Wait, well, I'll take one last question. It's fine.
I just was curious. Is there any relationship to the Library of Congress?
No. Yeah. That was easy. Is there any relation to ALA with the Library of Congress? And the answer is no. The Library of Congress is our national library. So just like we have the State Library of Oregon, the State Library of Oregon works closely with our Oregon Library Association, but they are two totally different organizations. So the Library of Congress is akin to that with the ALA.
Because I'm thinking the library really isn't any different than a business. How are you differentiated? If we are paying taxes for this, is this considered an educational facility or what? What's your category? Do you follow me?
Like a nonprofit or a for-profit business, a government agency?
Yeah, and if it's a business, then I don't know.
What are libraries under? Well, you're under the government because
Yeah.
you're Lake Oswego City Library.
Yeah, we here are a part of the city government. We're a department under the city of Lake Oswego, if that answers your question. So we're not a business. We're a government entity here. And there are other
Right.
systems or other organizational structures that exist for other libraries.
Yeah. Like ours is a independent library district, which means that we are, we're truly, I mean, the term independent is hard to not repeat, but we're independent of anything else. So we aren't part of the school system. We aren't part of the city. We aren't part of police or fire. We get money directly from property tax, and that money is ours to run independently. So it is not part of anything. And in a lot of ways, it's, I would say, considered governmental or nonprofit, but it's really none of the above is the best way to describe it. Not sure I would describe it that way either. Yeah.
Good questions. Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. This has been so informative and really appreciate your time today and all the work that you do to support intellectual freedom around Oregon. And I just want to draw everyone's attention to this table here at the back. We do have program surveys if you'd like to fill one out, and we have more information about Freedom to Read Month at the Lake Oswego Library. This is an event as part of our Freedom to Read Month series, but we have more and other activities. And there's also a link to our Freedom to Read Month webpage where we have quite a few of the links that Emily mentioned in her presentation, and we'll be adding more. The Intellectual Freedom Toolkit we'll be adding. And so if you're looking for any of those links, Library Bill of Rights, Freedom to Read Statement, those are all on that webpage, along with more information about the work that we do every day to support your freedom to read all year long. So feel free to take a flyer and a program survey and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.